The post was empty when I came down that morning, and I knew before anyone told me anything that something was wrong. Not because a guard's absence is unusual in itself. Men fall ill. Men are rotated. Men are given leave they have earned 3 times over, but because it was Corwin's post, and Corwin was never late, and Corwin was never gone without telling me first. I was 11 that autumn, and I want to say plainly, before I tell the rest of it, that nothing that happened to me in those weeks was frightening in the way a boy might imagine frightening. No one threatened me. No one came for me in the night. I was safe the entire time, in the ordinary, boring, well-guarded way that I had been safe every day of my life at the palace at Harrowgate. What frightened me was smaller than that, and, in its way, harder to hold, the sight of an empty corridor where a particular man should have been standing, and no one in the whole of that enormous palace willing to tell me why. I had gone down early, the way I always did, because Corwin liked to be at his post before the rest of the household stirred, and he had let me keep him company most mornings since I was 9, standing just inside the alcove where the tapestry of the old hunting party hung, out of the wind, talking about nothing in particular until the day proper began and I was pulled off to my tutors, and he was pulled into whatever formal stillness the day required of him. It was our time. My brother Bram was too young yet to care about mornings, and my sister Malin preferred her bed to any hour before 8, so those quiet minutes by the tapestry belonged to Corwin and me alone, and I had come to depend on them more than I think I let myself notice until they stopped. That morning the alcove held only cold stone and the tapestry's faded huntsman, frozen mid-chase, going nowhere. I stood there a long moment, certain I had simply come down too early, and when the minutes passed and no one arrived I told myself he had been called to breakfast with the other men, or was needed elsewhere for some drill I hadn't been told about. I went looking for him the way a boy looks for anyone he is fond of and slightly worried about without much strategy, mostly hope. I should explain who Corwin was to me, because if you did not know him, you will not understand why an empty stretch of corridor could undo a boy who otherwise had every comfort a person could ask for. He had been assigned to my household detail 2 years before, not long after I turned 9, back when I was still young enough to be nervous around the guards in a way I am slightly embarrassed to admit now. They are trained to a stillness that can feel, to a small child, less like safety, and more like being watched by statues that might, at any moment, decide to move. Corwin was different from the first week. He was exact in his duties. I never once saw him slouch, never saw his eyes wander from where they were meant to be, but he had a way of speaking to me, in the gaps the day allowed him, that made the distance between a guard and a prince feel much smaller than it was supposed to feel. He remembered the names of the wooden soldiers I used to line up along the windowsill of the East Gallery. He noticed, before anyone else did, the autumn I broke my wrist falling from the low wall by the orchard, that I was favoring my arm before I'd said a word to my nurse about the pain. He never told me stories about himself. Guards of his rank are trained not to, and he held that line as strictly as any other. But he listened to mine. All of them, even the ones that went nowhere and took far too long to tell, with a patience that never once looked performed. I remember one night in particular, the winter I was 10, when a storm rolled in off the sea hard enough to rattle the old windows of the east wing and set the whole palace groaning in a way that frightened me badly, though I would not have admitted it to anyone at the time. I had woken from a nightmare I could not afterward remember the shape of, only the fear it left behind, and had gone, half ashamed of myself for doing it, out into the corridor rather than ring for my nurse, because some instinct told me that whatever comfort I needed that night, I did not want it delivered with the fuss a summoned nurse would bring. Corwin was on the late watch that week, standing his post at the base of the east stair, and he did not so much as blink when I appeared at the top of it in my nightshirt at 2 in the morning, though I am certain, looking back, that I must have looked exactly as wild and frightened as I felt. He did not leave his post. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to who he was. He did not sweep me up and carry me back to bed the way a nurse might have, because that was not his place, and he knew the shape of his own duty too well to abandon it even for a frightened boy. What he did instead was speak to me quietly from where he stood, in a voice pitched low enough not to carry down the sleeping corridors, asking me what had frightened me, and then, when I could not quite say, simply telling me about the storm itself. How the wind found every loose shutter in an old building and made a great show of itself. How the palace had stood through 100 storms worse than this one, and would stand through 100 more. How the guards on the night watch rather liked a good storm. In truth, because it gave the long hours something to listen to besides their own footsteps. He talked to me like that, calm and steady and entirely undramatic, for perhaps 10 minutes, until my shivering stopped and my eyes grew heavy again, and only then did he tell me, gently, that I ought to go back to bed before my nurse woke to find me gone and worried herself sick. I did not think of it again for a long time. It was a small kindness, one of dozens he offered me over those 2 years without ever making a performance of any of it. But I thought of it constantly during the 3 weeks he was gone, because it seemed to me, lying awake in my own bed with an entirely different fear keeping me from sleep, that I had lost the one person in that whole enormous palace who knew how to sit with a frightened boy without either dismissing the fear or feeding it. That was, I think now, the real shape of what I missed most in those weeks, not simply Corwin himself, though I missed him plainly and constantly, but the particular steadiness he brought to fear, the sense that whatever storm was rattling the windows, someone nearby knew it would pass and was not troubled by the noise of it. By the time I was 11, Corwin was less a fixture of my protection and more, in the plain sense of the word, my friend. I do not think either of us would have used that word aloud. He was a royal guard of the kingdom of Eldermore, sworn to a discipline that did not leave much room for friendship in its official language, and I was a prince who had been taught since infancy that the men who stood at my doors were not playmates. But we both knew what we were to each other, in the way children and the adults who are kind to them always know, underneath whatever the rules say. That morning I went first to the guardroom off the east wing, where the duty rosters were kept, and found it occupied by 2 guards I knew only by sight, neither of them able or willing to tell me anything beyond the fact that Corwin was reassigned. I asked reassigned where? I asked reassigned since when? I asked, with what I now recognize as a child's stubborn faith that the right question would eventually produce the right answer, whether he was coming back. The older of the 2 guards, a broad, kind-faced man named Sergeant Doyle, crouched to something nearer my height and told me, gently but with the particular firmness the household guards use when they have been told exactly how much they are allowed to say, that Guard Hale's reassignment had come from very high up, that it was entirely proper, and that I should not worry myself over it. That last part, of course, is the one instruction no 11-year-old in the history of the world has ever successfully obeyed. I went next to the kitchens, because the kitchens at Harrowgate know everything before the rest of the household does, and I had learned this fact from years of trailing after the undercook, a stout, cheerful woman named Mistress Aldous, who had a habit of slipping me the ends of the morning loaves when no one was looking. She was kneading dough when I found her, and when I asked, carefully, whether she knew anything about Guard Hale, her hands stilled on the dough for just a moment before she went back to her work. And she told me, too brightly, in the voice adults use when they have decided in advance not to say the true thing, that guards came and went on the king's business all the time, and that I oughtn't fret over the comings and goings of men who knew their duty better than any of us. I want to note something here because it matters to everything that follows. Nobody lied to me. Not Doyle, not Mistress Aldous, not anyone in that first strange day. They simply declined to tell me the truth, and did it so carefully, so uniformly, that by mid-morning I understood the silence itself was the important thing. Not an accident of a busy palace, but a wall that had been built, deliberately, around one specific subject, and built by people high enough in the household to have every guard and every servant standing behind it without a single crack. I found my father in his study before noon, having worked up the nerve over the course of the morning, the way I always had to when I meant to ask him something he might not want to answer. King Alaric of Eldermore was not, as some of the old portraits in the long gallery might suggest to a stranger, a distant or forbidding man. He had always made time for me, even in the busiest seasons of his reign, and I had never once been afraid to walk into his study unannounced. That day, though, I noticed something in his face before I had said a single word, a tightness around his eyes that he smoothed away almost as quickly as it appeared, the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy and does not intend to set it down where a child can see the weight of it. "Father," I said, "where is Corwin?" He did not pretend not to understand me, which I was grateful for even then. He set down his pen, folded his hands on the desk, and looked at me with an expression I would spend the following weeks trying to read correctly and mostly failing. "Guard Hale has been given a temporary assignment," he said. "It is authorized by me personally. It is entirely proper, and it will not last forever. That is all I am able to tell you just now, Torin, and I need you to trust me that there are good reasons for that." "Is he in trouble?" "No," my father said, and here his voice was firm enough that I believed it absolutely, then and for a long time afterward, even when other things made me doubt it. "He has done nothing wrong. Quite the opposite. I will tell you more when I am able. Until then I am asking you to be patient and to let this rest." It is a strange thing, being asked by your own father, whom you trust completely, to stop wanting to know something that has taken up residence in the center of your chest and will not leave. I said I understood. I did not really, not yet. I left his study with the two facts I would hold on to through everything that came after, that Corwin had done nothing wrong, and that my father knew where he was, and I told myself that ought to be enough. It was not enough, not because I doubted my father, but because a boy of 11 does not have the architecture yet to simply set a worry down because he has been told the shape of it is safe. I carried it with me into the schoolroom that afternoon, where my tutor read the same paragraph of history to me 3 times because I could not make myself listen to it once. I carried it to supper, where my brother Bram chattered about a frog he had found by the fountain, and I nodded in all the places a person nods without hearing a word. I carried it up the stairs that night, past the alcove with the hunting tapestry, past the cold stretch of corridor where Corwin was not standing, and into my bed, where I lay for a long time listening to the ordinary sounds of the palace settling for the night and wondering, for the first time in my life, whether the walls I had grown up inside were keeping something out or keeping something in. I want to be honest about what that first day taught me, because it is the thing this whole story eventually proved true, even though it took me far too long to believe it while I was living through it. The palace was not hiding something shameful from me. It was protecting something precious, and it did not yet trust me, not because I was untrustworthy, but because I was 11, and 11-year-olds, however good their intentions, are not always able to keep a secret sealed the way a secret sometimes needs to be sealed. I did not know that yet. All I knew, lying in the dark that first night, was that the one adult in the palace who had never once made me feel small or unimportant had vanished without a word, and everyone else had closed ranks around the reason why. It was past 10, later than I was meant to be awake, when I heard voices from the corridor outside my door, my father's, low and controlled, and another I recognized after a moment as my uncle's, Duke Edmund of Rosemont, who had lately taken to spending long hours at the palace on matters no one explained to me in any more detail than they explained Corwin's absence. I was not supposed to be listening. I want to say that plainly because I have never been entirely proud of it. But I was a boy with an ache in his chest and an open door 2 rooms away, and I crept to my own door and cracked it, and I listened. If he hasn't sent word by the end of the week, We will need to consider a second team, my uncle was saying, his voice carrying that flat, careful evenness I would come to recognize over the following days, as the sound adults make when they are trying very hard not to sound afraid in front of each other. I don't like how long this has gone. He knows what he's doing, my father said. Give him the time he asked for. And if the risk to Adela is greater than we've judged it to be. There was a silence then, long enough that I thought perhaps they had moved off down the corridor, and I nearly closed my door and went back to bed, telling myself I had heard nothing that meant anything, that Adela, my great-aunt, a woman I saw perhaps twice a year at family gatherings and knew mostly through the stiff, formal portraits of her as a young woman that hung in the Eastern Hall, had nothing whatsoever to do with Corwin, or with me, or with the empty post by the hunting tapestry. But then my father spoke again, quieter now, quiet enough that I had to hold my breath to catch it. Then we trust the man we sent, he said. Corwin Hale has earned that much, Edmund, whatever it costs us to wait. I shut my door as softly as I could and stood with my back against it for a long time, my heart going harder than it had any business going for a boy who was, in that exact moment, in no danger at all. I did not understand most of what I had heard. I understood only two things clearly, and they did not fit together in any way that let me sleep. That Corwin's name and my great-aunt's name had been spoken in the same breath, in a tone that suggested risk, and that whatever was happening to him was serious enough that the King of Eldermore and his own brother stood arguing about it in a corridor at 10 o'clock at night, with their voices dropped low enough that even a listening boy could barely catch the words. I did not sleep well. I would not sleep well again, not properly, for the better part of 3 weeks. The days that followed settled into a strange, false ordinariness that I now understand was itself a kind of kindness on the part of everyone around me, though it did not feel like kindness at the time. My lessons continued. My meals continued. The rhythm of the household did not so much as ripple on its surface, and I think that was deliberate, a household full of people who had decided, without ever discussing it with me directly, that the best thing they could do for a worried boy was to keep everything else exactly the same. New guards rotated through Corwin's old post, competent men, courteous men, none of them him. I learned their names and was polite to each of them, and stood by the hunting tapestry alone most mornings, because it did not feel right to ask a stranger in Corwin's place to fill those quiet minutes the way Corwin had filled them, and none of them, I think, would have known how. I asked my sister Malin, who was 9 that year and had her own fondness for Corwin. He had once spent the better part of an hour helping her retrieve a kitten that had gotten itself stuck in the eaves above the stable yard, a story she told anyone who would listen for months afterward, whether she knew anything. She did not. She had noticed his absence too, in her own way, and had apparently decided, with the straightforward logic of a 9-year-old, that he must simply be on holiday, and would return when his holiday was finished. I did not have the heart to tell her that grown men do not vanish on holiday without a word to the children who love them, not when I did not yet understand the true shape of what had happened myself. I asked Bram, who was 6, and who mostly wanted to know whether the new guard by the tapestry knew any good frog-catching spots, which told me nothing except that 6-year-olds have their priorities admirably sorted. I went on the 3rd day to Captain Bresson, who commanded the household guard, and to whom even the guards I trusted, like Sergeant Doyle, ultimately answered. Bresson was a tall, spare man with a face carved by 4 decades of exact discipline, and I had always found him a little frightening in the specific way that perfectly correct men can be frightening to a child who is used to being indulged. I asked him directly, standing very straight the way I had seen my father stand when he meant to be taken seriously, where Guard Hale had been sent. "That information is not mine to give you, Your Highness," Bresson said, and there was nothing unkind in it. If anything, I sensed something almost apologetic beneath the correctness, though his face did not change to show it. I can tell you that his reassignment carries the king's own authorization, and that his record, which I have reviewed personally, as I review every guard's record, is without a single mark against it. Whatever you may hear elsewhere, Your Highness, I would ask you to hold onto that fact above all others. Whatever you may hear elsewhere. I turned that phrase over for the rest of the day, and it was not until the following week that I understood exactly what he had been warning me about. The next day, still turning Bresson's warning over in my mind, I went where I had never gone before on my own, the guards' mess hall, tucked below the armory, where the household detail took their meals between shifts, and where I had only ever been brought formally. On the rare occasions, my father wanted me to see how the men who protected us actually lived. I knew it was not, strictly, a place a prince wandered into unaccompanied, but I had reached the point in that long, strange week where the rules I had been raised inside felt less important to me than the questions I could not stop asking, and no one at the door thought to turn away a boy who walked in as though he had every right to be there. I found Sergeant Doyle at a long table with 3 other guards, midway through a meal, and when he saw me he did not send me away, though I noticed the slight straightening of the other men's backs, the way grown men arrange themselves when a child they respect has wandered somewhere unexpected. I asked, without much preamble because I had run out of patience for preamble by then, whether any of them had ever known a guard to be sent away like Corwin had suddenly, secretly, without explanation to the household. There was a silence at the table, the particular silence of men deciding together, without a word passing between them, how much to say. It was an older guard I did not know well, a broad, gray-haired man named Corporal Wren, who had served the household longer than any of the others at that table, who finally spoke. "Once that I know of," he said. "Long before your time, Your Highness, before your father was crowned, even when I was young in the service. A guard from this very detail went missing from his post for the better part of a month, and the whole palace buzzed with it the way this one's buzzing now, half of them certain he'd disgraced himself and run, the other half certain something terrible had happened to him. What had happened to him? Turned out he'd been sent, quiet as you like, to look into a threat against a member of the family that nobody wanted spoken of until it was safely dealt with," Wren said. "Came back a month later, thinner and grayer than he left, and never said a word about where he'd been beyond what he was permitted to say, which wasn't much. But I'll tell you what I remember most, Your Highness, more than the mystery of it. I remember that the household guard didn't lose an ounce of faith in him the whole time he was gone, not one man among us, because we knew the kind of man he was, and we trusted that whatever silence surrounded him, it wasn't a silence he'd earned by doing wrong." "How did you know that, if no one would tell you anything?" Wren considered the question longer than I expected, setting down his fork as though it deserved a proper answer rather than a quick one. "Because we knew him," he said finally. "Not the mystery of him, the man himself, day in and day out, for years before that month ever happened. A man shows you who he is 100 small ways before he's ever tested by something large, Your Highness, and if you've paid attention to the small ways, the large ones don't shake your faith in him near as easily as they might shake a stranger's. You've had 2 years of small ways with Guard Hale. I'd wager that's worth more to you right now than any explanation we could give you." I did not fully understand, sitting at that long table with my meal untouched in front of me, how much that answer would matter to me in the weeks that followed, but I understood enough of it that day to feel, for the first time since the empty post, something steadier than fear settle into the space where the fear had been living. It did not answer my question. It gave me something better than an answer. It gave me a reason to trust the not knowing itself, which was a harder and, I think now, more valuable thing to be given. Doyle walked me back up toward the family's wing when I had finished, and just before we parted at the base of the stairs, he added one more thing, quietly, as though it had only just occurred to him to say it. "That guard I mentioned from Wren's story," he said. He trained a good many of the younger men who came up under him over the years before he finally retired, taught them his own particular care for quiet, careful work. I'd wager you can guess who one of his best pupils turned out to be. I did not need to ask. I understood, walking the rest of the way up alone, that the household I lived inside had weathered exactly this kind of silence before, more than once, and had come through it whole each time, and that Corwin himself, whatever he was doing now, had learned some part of his craft from a man who had once stood in precisely the position Corwin stood in now, trusted with a secret too dangerous to share and trusted, too, to come home from it. It was 2 days after that conversation, still needing something more solid to hold, that I found a way to visit the wing where the household guards kept their quarters. A plain, narrow corridor of small, tidy rooms above the armory that I had visited perhaps twice before, both times trailing after Corwin on some errand he'd let me tag along for. I knew which door was his. I told the guard posted at the end of the corridor, a young man named Fenwick who did not yet know me well enough to say no to a prince with a straight back and a steady voice, that I wished to see whether Guard Hale had left anything of mine behind, a small untruth, the first I'd told in this whole business, and one I am still not entirely proud of, though I understood even then that the truth. I need to see his room because I am frightened and I do not know what else to do, would not have got me past the door. The room was almost exactly as I imagined he would have left it if he'd simply gone down to breakfast. His spare uniform hung pressed on its hook. His boots, the second pair, sat squared beneath the narrow bed. A small shelf held a handful of books, worn at the spines, and a wooden box I did not open, out of a respect that outlasted my curiosity. What was missing, as far as I could tell, was his travel kit, a canvas bag he had shown me once, laughing, on the day I'd asked him what a guard packed for when he was sent somewhere on short notice, and a leather notebook he carried everywhere, in which I had once seen him jotting something during a long, dull afternoon of standing post, and which he'd told me, with a small smile, was where he kept the things worth remembering. I stood in that room longer than I should have. It told me 2 things, and both of them mattered more than I understood at the time. First, that whatever had happened to Corwin, he had packed for it himself, deliberately, the way a man packs when he knows where he is going and expects to need certain things, not the way a man is taken somewhere against his will, with nothing gathered and nothing chosen. Second, that he had taken the notebook, which meant, whatever this was, it was the kind of work that required him to write things down and keep them close. I left the room quieter in my mind than I had entered it, though not less afraid. A man who packs his own bag has not been arrested. But a man who packs his own bag and vanishes without a word to the boy who stood with him every morning by the hunting tapestry has, in some way I could not yet name, chosen to leave a piece of that boy's trust behind him. And I did not yet have the years to understand that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is take that risk deliberately, because the alternative is worse. I was not, in those days, always the version of myself I would have liked to be, and I think it is worth saying so plainly rather than smoothing it over, because a boy carrying that much worry does not carry it gracefully all the time. 2 days after I stood in Corwin's empty room, Malin came to find me in the library, full of some small excitement about a picture she had drawn, wanting me to admire it the way I usually did without much effort. And I snapped at her, sharper than the moment deserved, sharper than she deserved, telling her I had no interest in her silly drawing, and did she not understand that something serious was happening in this house? She went very still, the way small children go still when an older sibling they trust has suddenly turned strange on them, and then she left the room without a word, and I sat alone afterward feeling considerably worse than I had before she arrived. I found her an hour later in the nursery, curled on the window seat with the drawing still in her hand, and I made myself do the harder thing, which was to sit beside her and tell her I was sorry, that none of what was wrong was her fault, and that her drawing, A rather good likeness, in fact, of the stable cat that had adopted her the previous spring, deserved better than what I had given it. She forgave me easily, the way 9-year-olds usually do forgive the people they love. But she asked me, in the small, direct way she had, why I was so unhappy, and I found myself, for the first time, trying to explain it to someone even younger and more powerless than I was, which meant I had to find calmer words for it than I had used with anyone else. "I'm scared something bad happened to Corwin," I told her, "and I'm scared nobody will tell me, and I don't know how to stop being scared when I don't know what I'm scared of." Malin considered this with the particular seriousness 9-year-olds bring to questions they have decided matter. "Papa says Corwin didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I believe Papa. Don't you believe Papa?" It was such a simple question, asked so plainly, that it caught me somewhere I had not expected to be caught. I did believe my father. I had never once doubted the truth of what he told me, only the completeness of it. And hearing Malin lay the matter out with a child's uncomplicated trust reminded me that I had been so busy chasing the missing pieces that I had nearly stopped noticing the solid ground I was already standing on. I told her yes, I did believe him, and she nodded, satisfied, as though the matter were now settled, and went back to her drawing. And I sat with her a while longer, grateful in a way I did not fully have words for at the time that she had managed, without meaning to hand me back something I had been in danger of losing hold of. I resolved, after that afternoon, to be gentler with the people around me for the remainder of the ordeal, whatever it turned out to be, and I did not always succeed. Worry has a way of wearing through good intentions faster than a person expects. But I remembered that afternoon with Malin often enough, in the weeks that followed, that it served as a kind of anchor each time my temper threatened to slip again. Somewhere in the middle of that stretch, unable to simply sit with the not knowing any longer, I did something that felt, at the time, like the most sensible idea I'd had in days, and which I can now admit was somewhat less sensible than it felt. I decided to write Corwin a letter. I did not know where he was, which ought to have been the end of the matter, but I told myself that the palace must have some way of reaching its own guards even on secret assignment, some channel of correspondence that would find him eventually even if I did not know the route it traveled. And I sat at the small writing desk in my room one evening and wrote him 3 pages I am still, in a quiet way, rather proud of. I told him about Malin's kitten story, which she was still telling anyone who would listen. I told him about the mare Rowan had shown me, and my 3 respectable shots on the archery range. I told him, near the end, in words considerably plainer than anything I had managed to say aloud to anyone, that I missed him, that I was frightened for him even though everyone kept telling me not to be, and that whatever he was doing, wherever he was, I hoped he knew someone at home was thinking of him every single morning at the exact hour we used to stand together by the tapestry. I folded the pages carefully and sealed them and carried them the next morning to the small office near the guardroom where the household's official correspondence was handled, and asked the clerk on duty, a thin, harried young man who was clearly unused to being approached directly by a prince, whether he could see the letter delivered to Guard Hale. He looked for a moment, genuinely pained on my behalf. "I'm very sorry, Your Highness," he said, "but I don't have an address for Guard Hale. I don't believe anyone in this office does. His correspondence, if any needs to reach him, isn't handled through the ordinary channels." I asked whether there was any channel at all, ordinary or otherwise, and he admitted gently that if such a channel existed, it existed several levels above his own authority, in offices he had no access to himself. I left that small room considerably more deflated than I had entered it, the 3 pages still sealed and useless in my hands, and I did not, for a moment, know what to do with them. It was Sergeant Doyle, finding me sitting on the stairs outside the correspondence office with the letter still in my lap, who offered the solution I eventually settled on. He did not promise me the letter would reach Corwin. He was too honest a man, I think, to make a promise he could not be certain of keeping, but he offered to hold it for me himself in his own quarters, so that the moment Corwin returned, whenever that turned out to be, it would be waiting for him, delivered by a friend rather than lost somewhere in an office that had no idea what to do with it. It might not reach him before he's home again, Doyle told me, in which case you'll have the pleasure of handing it to him yourself, which I dare say will please you both a good deal more than any letter could. But if there's a way to get it to him sooner, Your Highness, I promise you I'll find it, because I don't imagine there's a man in this whole household who wouldn't want Guard Hale to know, wherever he is, that a boy sat down and wrote him 3 pages rather than simply waiting out the silence. I gave him the letter and felt, handing it over, a small and unexpected lightening. Not because I believed it would necessarily reach Corwin any faster, but because I had done something at last instead of only enduring, and there is a particular relief in action, however small, that waiting alone can never quite provide. I did not know, that afternoon on the stairs, that the letter would in fact make its way to him eventually, carried by a channel neither Doyle nor I could have predicted, and that it would arrive at a moment when, by his own later account, he needed the reminder of home rather badly. But that is getting ahead of the story, and I have promised to tell it in the order I lived it. The rumor, when it started, did not start with anyone who meant me harm. It started, as most rumors in a great household do, with someone filling a silence, because a silence that sighs cannot survive long inside walls full of people who notice everything. I heard the first version of it from a scullery girl not much older than myself, a niece of one of the laundresses who had been brought in to help during a busy week, and did not yet know the household's unspoken rule about which subjects were not to be discussed near the royal children. She was talking to another girl by the linen stores, not troubling to lower her voice, when I passed with my tutor on the way to the library, and I caught only a fragment. Took him away in the middle of the night. My aunt said, 2 men she didn't know, and nobody's seen him since. Before my tutor, catching the direction of my attention, steered me firmly around the corner and into a conversation about Eldermore's early kings that I could not have repeated back to save my life. I did not sleep at all well that night. I lay awake constructing, and then dismantling, and then reconstructing, a dozen versions of what took him away might mean, none of them anywhere near as calm and orderly as reassigned by the king's own authorization, and all of them, I am ashamed to say now, considerably more dramatic than the truth turned out to be, because that is what a frightened imagination does when it is not given anything solid to hold instead. I thought of the low, careful voices outside my door. I thought of the risk to Adela. I thought of Bresson's warning about what I might hear elsewhere, and I understood with a sick lurch that the rumor the scullery girl had repeated must be exactly the kind of thing he had been trying to prepare me for, not because it was true, but because it was the sort of story that spreads fastest and hurts the worst, and he had known it was already loose in the household before I ever heard it. I want to pause here and say something about what I did next, because I am not entirely proud of it, though I understand, looking back, why I did it. I began, in the days that followed, to watch everyone. I watched my father's face at breakfast for any sign that the news had turned worse overnight. I watched Duke Edmund, who came and went from the palace with increasing frequency that week, for any change in the set of his shoulders. I watched the household guards, hoping one of them might let something slip in an unguarded moment, the way adults sometimes do around children they have decided are too young to understand what they are hearing. I was not a spy by nature. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this sounds. I was a boy trying to build, out of scraps, some picture solid enough to stand on, because the not knowing had become heavier than almost any true thing could have been. It was on the 9th day, I believe. I had begun, without quite meaning to, counting them, that I overheard the exchange that changed the shape of my fear entirely, and set the whole middle stretch of this story in motion. My father's study had a second door, one that opened onto the small antechamber where petitioners waited before their audiences, and it was rarely used, rarely even remembered, except by the pages who kept it oiled and the children who had, at one time or another, discovered it could be used to slip in and out of the study without passing the guards at the main entrance. I had used it myself, harmlessly, 100 times before, to bring my father a drawing or interrupt him with some small excitement of my day. That afternoon I used it because I had heard voices through the antechamber wall, my father's, and Duke Edmund's again, and a third voice I did not immediately place, and some part of me that I am not proud of decided the truth mattered more than the manners I had been raised with. Confirms what we suspected, the unfamiliar voice was saying, a clipped, precise voice I would later learn belonged to a man from the palace's own protective service, one of the quiet officials who worked alongside the household guard but rarely appeared in public rooms. Someone inside has been feeding information out for weeks. We don't yet know who. And Hale is close to identifying them, my father asked. Close, not certain. He believes whoever it is has ties to the old business, Cassius's circle, or what's left of it since the ledger came out. If that's right, the target isn't random. It's Adela, and it's been Adela for some time. How much longer does he need? I can't say with confidence. If he's caught before he finishes, it could go very badly for him and worse for her. I did not hear anything after that, because I had already backed away from the door, my own breathing loud enough in my ears that I was terrified it would carry through the wood. I made it to the end of the antechamber and out into the corridor and stood there, gripping the cold stone of the wall, turning over the words I had just heard until they arranged themselves, in my frightened mind, into the worst shape they could possibly take. Someone inside the palace was working against us. Corwin was hunting them alone, somewhere I did not know, and if he was caught, it could go very badly for him. I did not understand, standing in that corridor, that go badly, in the careful language of palace officials, meant something closer to failure and delay than to the images that had already begun assembling themselves behind my eyes. A boy of 11 does not naturally translate a grown man's caution into anything less than the worst word he can imagine. I spent that entire night convinced, in the particular absolute way that children are capable of being convinced of things, that Corwin was in real danger, that he had been sent somewhere terrible to catch someone terrible, and that the reason no one would tell me anything was that the truth was too awful to hand to an 11-year-old. I want to be honest that this was the lowest point of the whole affair for me, and I want to be equally honest, because it matters to the shape of this story, that even at its lowest point I was never in the smallest danger myself. Whatever was happening, it was happening far from Harrowgate, to a grown man trained and equipped and trusted with exactly this kind of work. I was warm in my bed, in a palace as heavily guarded as any building in the kingdom, surrounded by people who loved me. But a child's fear does not require proximity to be real, and mine, that week, was as real to me as anything I have felt before or since. There was a second thing, worse in a smaller, more private way, that took root in me over the following days, and I have never told anyone this part of it until now. A little over a week before Corwin vanished, I had asked him to do something he should not have done, a small thing, in the ordinary run of a boy's mischief, but a real breach of his post nonetheless. There was a passage behind the old orangery that connected, if you knew the way, to the kitchen gardens without passing any of the formal walks where a guard was meant to keep me in sight at all times, and I had begged him, on a bright afternoon when I was restless and bored with my lessons, to let me take it alone, just once, just for a few minutes, so that I could feel. I remember trying to explain this to him, and not quite having the words for it. Like an ordinary boy, instead of a prince who was watched every moment of every day. He had refused me twice. The third time, worn down by my nagging and, I think, moved by something genuine in my restlessness that he recognized and had some sympathy for, He had let me go, walking the long way around himself so that he could meet me at the garden's far gate within sight of it the whole time, technically never losing me from view, though he had bent the letter of his post to do it. It had been nothing. No one had been hurt. No one but the two of us had ever known. But in the fevered logic of a frightened 11-year-old lying awake at midnight, that small kindness rearranged itself into something monstrous. What if someone had found out? What if that single bent rule that I had begged him for was the reason he had been sent away, not on some grand and dangerous mission at all, but in disgrace, quietly, so that no one would have to say aloud that a royal guard had broken his post for a boy who could not simply behave himself? What if the danger the officials spoke of in low voices through my father's study door was not a threat to Corwin from some enemy of the crown, but a threat to his career, his honor, his whole future, and I was the cause of it? I carried that fear alone for 3 days before it became too heavy to carry, and on the third night I went to my brother Rowan. I should say my brother, though he is a good deal older than me and stands to inherit the throne one day, has never once made me feel the distance those two facts might suggest. Crown Prince Rowan had, since I was very small, been the person in the family I went to when a thing felt too large for me to hold on my own, and his wife, my sister-in-law Alara, has a particular gift for making a frightened child feel, within a few minutes of sitting with her, that whatever is wrong can be borne. I found them together that evening in the small sitting room they kept in their own apartments, and I told them everything. The empty post, the overheard voices, Adela's name, the phrase "go badly," and finally, my voice breaking in a way that embarrassed me even as I could not stop it, the secret about the orangery passage and my fear that I had ruined a good man's life because I had wanted, for 10 minutes on an ordinary afternoon, to feel like anyone else. Alara held me while I finished, and did not tell me to stop crying, which I have since come to understand is one of the kindest things a person can decline to say to a child who needs, very badly, to finish crying. Rowan waited until I was steadier, and then he crouched down in front of me the way our father had years ago, when I was small enough that eye level meant kneeling, and he told me 3 things I have never forgotten. First, he said, whatever is happening with Corwin has nothing to do with that afternoon at the orangery. I promise you that. Men are not sent away on serious business because a boy once talked his guard into taking the long way round a garden. If that were the standard, half the guards in this household would be reassigned by now, myself included, for things I talked them into when I was your age that were considerably worse than yours. That got the first real breath of relief through me since the 9th day, though I did not yet fully believe it. Second, he said, our father does not lie to you, and he has not lied to you now. Corwin has done nothing wrong. That is a fact, Torin, not a kindness meant to soften something worse. Hold on to it. Third, Alara said, taking over gently when Rowan paused, there is a difference between a family keeping a secret from you because they don't trust you, and a family keeping a secret because the secret itself is dangerous to know. I cannot tell you which this is, because I do not know the details myself. Very few people do by design. But I can tell you, from everything I have seen in this family and in this household, that your father does not build walls out of cruelty. If he has built one here, it is because he believes, with good reason, that the wall is protecting someone. Possibly several someones, possibly including you. I asked her, in the small voice I am not ashamed of now though I was then, whether that meant Corwin was truly in danger. She did not answer that directly, and I noticed, even through my exhaustion, that she did not. I believe, she said instead, that your father trusts Corwin completely, and that a man who is trusted that completely by a king is a man who has been chosen because he is very, very good at what he does. That is not nothing, Torin. Hold on to that too. I went to bed that night lighter than I had been in days, though not fully at peace. The fear about the orangery had lifted almost entirely, which mattered more to me in that moment than anything else. But the larger question, whether Corwin was safe, whether he was coming back, remained exactly where it had been, unanswered and unanswerable, hanging over the household like weather that would not break. Rowan came to find me the following morning, before my lessons began, and told me, in the easy, offhand way he had of making an instruction feel like an invitation, that he wanted my company for the day, a visit to the stables to look over a new mare that had arrived for the household's use, and afterward, if I felt like it, an hour on the range where the older guards sometimes let the royal children try their hand at archery under close supervision. I understood, even as I agreed, that this was not really about the mare or the archery. It was Rowan doing, in his own quiet way, what Alara had done the night before with her patient listening, giving me something to hold onto besides the fear, before the fear could hollow me out entirely. The mare was a handsome gray, skittish with strangers but gentle once she'd taken your measure, and Rowan showed me how to approach her slowly, palm out, letting her come to the decision to trust me rather than forcing it on her. "Trust doesn't move at the speed you want it to," he said, while the mare lipped cautiously at the apple in my hand, "no matter how much you might wish it did. You can't hurry a horse into believing you're safe, and you can't hurry a household into telling you a secret before it's ready to be told. Both of them get there in their own time, if you're patient and don't do anything to break the trust that's already there." I told him that felt like a very convenient thing for him to say, given the conversation we'd had the night before, and he laughed, properly laughed, the first real laugh I'd managed to pull from anyone in days, and admitted that yes, he supposed it was rather convenient, but that didn't make it any less true. On the range that afternoon, under Captain Bresson's watchful, exacting eye, I managed 3 respectable shots out of a dozen, which Rowan declared, with what I suspect was more generosity than accuracy demanded, to be excellent progress for a boy who'd only had the bow in his hands a handful of times before. Bresson himself, correcting my stance with 2 firm hands on my shoulders, said nothing about Corwin at all, and I found I did not need him to. There was something steadying simply in standing on that ordinary stretch of grass, doing an ordinary thing, surrounded by men who knew exactly what I was carrying and had chosen, for one afternoon, to let me set it down rather than ask me to explain it. We walked back toward the palace as the light went long and gold across the lawns, and Rowan, in the unhurried way he had of saying the most important things last, told me something I did not fully appreciate until much later. "You'll notice," he said, "that not one person in this household, not Bresson, not Doyle, not your father, not Edmund, has ever once told you to stop feeling what you're feeling. We've asked you to be patient. We've asked you to trust us a while longer. But nobody's asked you to pretend you're not afraid, because that would be a foolish thing to ask of anyone, let alone an 11-year-old who's lost the person he sees every morning. Feel it as hard as you need to, Torin. Just don't let it convince you of things nobody's actually told you are true." I held onto that the rest of the evening, and for a while it worked exactly as he must have intended. The fear did not vanish, but it stopped, for a day or two, driving quite so many of my worst imaginings. It was 2 days later that the false dawn came, and it came from the last direction I expected. Malin and I shared a tutor for our afternoon lessons in language and history, along with 2 other children of the household, the sons of a visiting minister, brought along that season while their father conducted some lengthy business with the crown, and neither much older than 9. It was one of these boys, a freckled, confident child named Oswin, who fancied himself very well informed, because his father let him linger near adult conversations he did not fully understand, who leaned across the lesson table during a pause in our reading, and said, in the too loud whisper children use when they believe they are being discreet, that he had heard his father telling another minister that one of the palace guards had been arrested, the one who used to watch the young prince, caught doing something he shouldn't, and that was why nobody would talk about it. I do not remember standing up. I remember only that I was standing, and that the room had gone very quiet, and that our tutor, a mild, unflappable woman named Mistress Corliss, who had taught 3 generations of the royal children and had never once in my memory raised her voice, was on her feet as well, moving toward me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Malin, beside me, had gone very pale and reached for my sleeve, and I understood, distantly, underneath the roaring in my own ears, that I had frightened her without meaning to. "That is not true," I said to Oswin, to the room, to no one in particular, my voice cracking in a way that humiliated me even as it happened. "That is not true. You don't know anything about it." Mistress Corliss had a hand on my shoulder by then, steering me, not unkindly, toward the door and the corridor beyond it, murmuring something to the other children about a short recess while she saw to me. I do not know exactly what I said in the corridor, only that it came out of me in a rush I could not control, all of it, the empty post, the counted days, the overheard voices, the rumor from the scullery girl, and now this, delivered so casually by a boy who had no idea what he was carrying when he repeated it, and that Mistress Corliss listened to all of it without once telling me to calm myself, which I have since decided is, again, exactly the right thing to decline, to say to a child in that state. "I do not know what has become of Guard Hale," she told me when I had run down at last, "and I will not pretend to you that I do. But I have known this household a very long time, your highness, and I have never once seen it close ranks around a shameful thing the way it has closed ranks around this one. Shame does not organize a household this thoroughly. Only care does that. I would ask you to consider the difference." It was, I think now, the first crack of real daylight through the whole dark stretch of that fortnight, though it did not feel like daylight at the time. It felt like one more adult asking me to trust a wall I could not see over. But something in the way she said it stayed with me, because Mistress Corliss was not a woman given to comforting exaggeration, and I trusted her plainness more than I trusted almost anyone's kindness. I found Duke Edmund that same evening, in the long gallery where he had taken, since his more frequent visits began, to walking alone in the hour before supper, a habit I had noticed without understanding. My uncle was, in those years, still a fairly new presence in my daily life. A steady, careful, somewhat formal man who oversaw matters of household security and review that no one had ever fully explained to me, and whom I knew mostly as a quiet figure at family dinners, rather than someone I sought out directly. I sought him out that evening anyway, because I was out of other adults to ask, and because I remembered suddenly that it had been his voice through the antechamber wall, asking my father how much longer. "I heard a boy at my lessons say Corwin was arrested," I told him, without preamble, because I did not have the composure left for one. "Is that true?" Duke Edmund stopped walking. He was not, by nature, an expressive man. I had come to understand that much about him already, but something moved across his face at my question that I can only describe as genuine anger, quickly controlled. "No," he said, "that is not true, and I am sorry you heard it, and sorrier still that it reached you before I could get ahead of it. Guard Hale has not been arrested. He has not done anything that would warrant arrest. I will not have that repeated in this household again if I can help it, and I intend to find out exactly how it started." "Then why won't anyone tell me what did happen?" He studied me for a long moment, the way I imagine he studied the night logs and duty rosters that were, I would later learn, so much a part of his work in the household, carefully, without hurry, weighing what was safe to say against what was not. Because the fewer people who know the details of Guard Hale's work right now, the safer that work remains, and the safer he remains while he is doing it, he said finally. "That includes you, Torin, not because we doubt you, but because you are 11 and 11-year-olds, through no fault of their own, sometimes say things to the wrong person without understanding what those things mean. It is not a judgment on your character. It is simply arithmetic. The fewer mouths a secret passes through, the longer it stays a secret, and right now, staying a secret is what is keeping people safe." People, not just Corwin. Not just Corwin, he agreed, and did not elaborate further, though I understood, from the careful way he held the rest back, that Adela's name was sitting behind his silence exactly where it had been sitting behind my father's. I can tell you one more thing, and then I must ask you to let this rest a while longer, he said. I have reviewed, in the course of my own work these past weeks, more of what Guard Hale has reported back than almost anyone else in this household, your father excepted. I want you to hear this from someone who has actually seen the evidence, and not simply heard the rumors. He is doing careful, disciplined, honorable work, exactly the kind of work this family trusts him for. I would stake my own name on that. I am telling you this because I think you have earned more than trust me and ask nothing, even if I cannot yet give you everything. Will that hold you a little longer? It did hold me, not perfectly, not without the occasional midnight relapse into worry, but it held me in a way the earlier reassurances had not quite managed, because it came from a man who had told me, in the same breath, both what he could give me and exactly why he could not give me more. And there is something in a plainly drawn boundary that a child can rest against more easily than a vague one. I saw Oswin again at lessons the following afternoon, and I want to record honestly that my first instinct, seeing his freckled, slightly nervous face across the table, was something close to anger, the memory of standing up too fast, my voice cracking in front of the whole room, was still raw enough that I had half a mind to say something cutting to him and let him feel a fraction of what he had made me feel. Mistress Corliss, perhaps sensing exactly that instinct working itself up in me, arranged for us to sit together over a shared reading exercise that day, which I suspected, even then, was not entirely an accident. It was Oswin himself, haltingly, who spoke first, before I had decided what I meant to say. "I'm sorry," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. My father was going to be very cross if he knew I'd repeated that. I didn't understand it would upset you so much. I just wanted the other boys to think I knew important things. He looked, saying it, considerably younger than his 9 years, and considerably more miserable than I had expected, and something in his plain, unpolished apology, the admission that he had wanted, in a small and rather ordinary way, to seem important, rather than any real wish to hurt me, took the last of the anger out of me before I had even used it. I thought, sitting there, of Duke Edmund's flash of controlled fury in the long gallery, and of Mistress Corliss's careful, unshaken calm, and I understood that both of those responses had been aimed at the rumor itself, at the carelessness of the adults who had let it travel within earshot of children, and not really at Oswin, who was, after all, only 9, and only guilty of repeating something he had overheard and misunderstood the weight of, in exactly the way I might have done myself in his position. "You didn't know," I told him, and found, saying it, that I meant it. "I'm not angry at you. I was scared, and it came out as angry, but it wasn't really about you." He looked so plainly relieved that I nearly laughed, and by the end of that lesson we had returned, more or less, to the easy, uncomplicated companionship of two boys who happened to share a tutor for a season, though I noticed he was considerably more careful, in the weeks that followed, about repeating anything he heard second-hand from his father's conversations. I did not think at the time that this small reconciliation mattered very much in the larger shape of the story I was living through. I understand now that it mattered a great deal, that the grace I found with some effort to extend to a frightened 9-year-old who had made an honest mistake was the same grace the household would later extend to Master Pell, and the same grace Adela would extend to a family that had kept her in the dark for her own protection, and that a household which teaches its children, even by hard example, how to be angry at a wrong without being cruel to the person who stumbled into it, is teaching them something considerably more valuable than any single answer to any single mystery. My father had taken to looking in on me most nights that fortnight, a habit he had not kept since I was much younger, slipping into my room after I was meant to be asleep to sit for a few quiet minutes at the edge of the bed, not always speaking, sometimes simply resting a hand briefly on my shoulder before he rose to leave. I pretended to be asleep on most of those visits, not because I minded him being there, but because I sensed, somehow, that he needed those few silent minutes as much as I did, and that pretending gave him permission to sit with his own worry without having to perform composure for my benefit the way he did during the daylight hours. I understood even then, without anyone explaining it to me, that a father carrying a secret that heavy, watching his own son suffer for want of it, was paying a cost of his own that no one in the household ever spoke of, because kings are not generally permitted the luxury of being comforted the way their children are. One of those nights, near the end of that second week, I did not pretend. I opened my eyes when he sat down, and he did not startle, only looked at me with an expression that was, for once, entirely unguarded, tired, and fond, and carrying something that looked almost like an apology he had not yet worked out how to give in full daylight. "I hate this part of it," he told me quietly in the dark. "I want you to know that, Torin, whatever else you come to understand about why I've kept this from you. I do not enjoy watching you carry a weight I could lift with a single sentence. I am choosing this because I believe it is right, not because it costs me nothing to choose it." "I know, Father," I said, and found, saying it in the dark with no one else to hear, that I meant it more fully than I had managed to mean it in any of our daylight conversations. There was something about the honesty of that late hour, the two of us admitting plainly to each other how hard the waiting was, that did more to steady me than any of the careful reassurances offered during the ordinary business of the day. He sat with me a little longer after that, neither of us speaking, until my eyes grew heavy again on their own, and when I woke the next morning I remembered it less as a conversation than as a feeling, the sense of having been, even in the depth of that long, uncertain fortnight, thoroughly and unmistakably loved by a man who was carrying far more than he ever let the rest of the household see. It was 3 days after that quiet night, my father true to nothing so much as his own patient timing, that he finally gave me the peace that carried me the rest of the way to the end. He called me into his study in the evening after supper, and this time there was no tightness held carefully behind his eyes. If anything, he looked like a man who had decided something and was relieved to have decided it. He asked me to sit, which he did not usually do for our conversations, and that alone told me something had shifted. "I have thought a great deal, these past weeks, about how much to tell you," he said, "and I want you to understand that the silence has never been about whether I trust you, Torin. It has been about whether the secret itself could survive being known by one more person, however dear that person is to me. I believe now that it can survive being known by you, in part, if you understand that the part I withhold still matters, and that withholding it is still protecting people you care about." He told me that evening, more than anyone else had told me in the whole of that fortnight, though still, I would learn afterward, not everything. He told me that Corwin had been sent away on a matter of household security, at the king's own direct request, because Corwin possessed particular skills my father did not fully explain to me then, though I would later learn they came from earlier training Corwin had received before he ever stood a ceremonial post, that made him uniquely suited to a task no one else could be spared for without drawing dangerous attention. He told me that the task concerned the safety of a member of our family, and that it was going, as far as anyone could tell from a distance, according to plan, though not as quickly as anyone would have liked. He told me that Corwin had asked before he left that I not be told any of it, not because he doubted my ability to keep a secret, but because he could not bear the thought of asking an 11-year-old to carry a weight like that, and had rather I simply believe he would come back and trust that belief on its own. That last part undid something in me that all the rest of it had not quite managed to touch. I had spent 3 weeks afraid that Corwin had left without a thought for how it would land on me. Instead, it seemed, he had thought of almost nothing else, and had chosen the silence anyway because he judged it the kinder weight for me to carry. "When is he coming back?" I asked. "Soon, I believe," my father said. "I cannot promise you a day, but soon." I slept better that night than I had in 3 weeks, not because the mystery was solved. It was not yet, not fully, but because I finally understood the shape of the thing I had been carrying, even without every detail of what filled that shape. It was not shame. It was not danger to me. It was, as Mistress Corliss had said, something built out of care rather than something built to hide a wrong, and once I believed that all the way down, the waiting became bearable in a way it had not been before. The waiting, as it happened, did not last much longer. 5 nights after my father spoke with me in his study, I woke past midnight to the particular quality of noise a large house makes when it has decided, all at once, to stop pretending to be asleep, footsteps in corridors that should have been empty, a door somewhere below opening, and closing with more purpose than caution, low voices carrying up the stairwell in tones that were urgent without being frightened. I lay still for a moment, trying to place the difference between this stirring and the ordinary night sounds of the palace, and then I was out of bed, and at my door before I had properly decided to move. I found Sergeant Doyle in the corridor, and for once he did not try to steer me back toward my room. "He's back, Your Highness," Doyle said, and even in the dim light of the corridor lamps I could see he was smiling, which I had not seen him do once in the whole of the preceding weeks. "Come through the side gate not 20 minutes ago. Your father's with him now, and the Duke." I did not wait to be given leave. I went down the stairs faster than I have ever gone down them before or since, my sister-in-law Ilara calling something after me from her own doorway that I did not catch and did not stop for, and I came into the small receiving room off the guard's entrance to find Corwin Hale standing there, travel-worn, thinner than I remembered him, a healing scrape along one cheekbone that he would later tell me came from nothing more dramatic than a fall on wet cobblestones 3 weeks into his work. And entirely, unmistakably, wonderfully alive. I did not manage anything dignified. I do not think an 11-year-old boy, 3 weeks deep into the worst worry of his life, owes anyone dignity in that particular moment, and I have never regretted crossing that room the way I crossed it, or the fact that Corwin, seeing me come, went down on one knee without being asked, the way he used to when I was smaller, and caught me before I could quite manage to stop myself, and hold back the way I had been raised to hold back. "I'm sorry," he said into my shoulder before I had said anything at all. "I am so sorry, Torin. I knew what it would do to you, leaving the way I did, and I did it anyway because I judged it the safer thing, and I need you to know I have thought about that every single day I was gone." I could not speak for a moment. When I could, all I managed was, "You were supposed to tell me." "I know," he said. "I am going to explain everything I am permitted to explain right now tonight, and I am not going to let you go to bed still wondering. You've earned that much and more." My father was there and Duke Edmund, and within a few minutes Rowan and Ilara as well, roused by the same commotion that had brought me down, and it was in that room, past 1 in the morning, still in my night clothes, that I finally heard the whole of what had happened. Not every operational detail, some of which I would not learn until I was considerably older, but enough that night to understand the shape of it completely. Weeks earlier, before Corwin ever vanished from his post, the palace's protective service had grown concerned about a pattern of small, hard-to-explain leaks, decisions and movements within the household finding their way, in distorted form, into places they had no business reaching. Duke Edmund, whose review of the household security procedures had begun as routine and turned serious as the pattern sharpened, traced enough of it to conclude that someone inside Harrowgate itself was passing information outward, quietly, for money, to people connected to the old business surrounding my step-grandmother Morwenna's disgraced circle. The remnants of what had once orbited Lord Cassius, scattered and diminished since the ledger that exposed his schemes had come to light, but not. It turned out entirely gone. Most worryingly, The information appeared to concern my great aunt Adela, whose quiet estate at Ashcombe sat well outside the palace's usual ring of protection, and who had, without ever fully realizing its significance, come into possession of a set of old papers years before, records connected to that same disgraced business, kept by her out of nothing more sinister than a habit of never throwing away correspondence, and never once suspected by her to be of the smallest interest to anyone. Someone believed those papers could still do damage if they resurfaced, or could still be sold, or used, or destroyed to protect whoever remained exposed by them, and that someone had begun making careful, deniable inquiries about Ashcombe's routines. Who came and went, when the staff changed shift, when Adela traveled and when she did not. We needed someone to go to Ashcombe without appearing to go there, my father told me. Someone who could watch and gather what proof there was, and if necessary intervene, without any announcement that would tell whoever was leaking information from inside these walls that we had noticed them at all. The moment we moved a visible detail to Adela's estate, or reassigned a guard through the ordinary channels with the ordinary paperwork everyone in this household can read, we risked warning the very people we were trying to catch. Corwin's disappearance had to look exactly like what it looked like to you, Torin, sudden, unexplained, unofficial, because a mystery that puzzled the household was far less dangerous than a plan that tipped our hand. And Corwin was the one who could do it because I started, and Corwin himself finished it for me gently. Because before I ever stood a post with a rifle and a bearskin, I trained for several years in a different branch of service, he said. The kind of work that teaches a man to watch a place quietly, to notice what's wrong before it becomes dangerous, and to gather what he sees without being seen doing it. It's not work I talk about, because it isn't work suited to conversation over the fence, so to speak. But it's why your father trusted me with this, and why Duke Edmund signed off on it. I wasn't the only choice. I was, your father judged, the safest one, because moving me quietly wouldn't draw the kind of attention moving anyone from Edmund's own protective service would have drawn. I asked because I had to, whether he had ever been in real danger. There were a few uneasy nights, he admitted, and I noticed my father's jaw tighten slightly at whatever memory that admission touched, though he did not interrupt. The man we were watching was cautious and clever enough to nearly slip us twice, but I want to be honest with you rather than tell you a story with all the edges smoothed off, because you've earned honesty more than most people your age ever have to earn it. It was careful work, not reckless work. No one struck a blow, no one drew a weapon. In the end, it was patience that won it, patience, and the fact that your uncle's review had already narrowed down, from inside the palace, who among the staff had access to the particular schedules that kept leaking out. I have to tell you something, Corwin added, before I could ask my next question, and for the first time that night something almost sheepish crossed his tired face. About 2 weeks in, when the work was hardest and I was about as low as I got the whole time, Duke Edmund's people found a way to get a small parcel out to me through channels I still don't fully understand myself. Inside it was a letter, 3 pages, in handwriting I'd know anywhere, about a kitten and a gray mare, and 3 shots on an archery range. I want you to know I read it more times than I'll admit to in front of your father, and I carried it the rest of the way through, folded up against my chest under my coat, and I credit it, more than a little, with reminding me exactly why the work mattered enough to finish properly. I felt my face go hot and my eyes sting at once, understanding only then that Doyle had somehow, quietly, kept his promise after all, and Doyle himself, standing near the door, allowed himself the smallest satisfied smile and said nothing at all. Rowan, who had been quiet through most of the explanation, listening the way he always listened when something mattered, asked the question I think all of us had been circling without quite landing on. Why didn't you tell any of us how bad it got, until tonight? Father knew the broad shape of it surely, even while you were away. He knew, Corwin said, because he had to for the decisions that needed making on this end. But there's a difference between what a commander needs to know to make good choices, and what a family needs to be told to sleep easy, and I did my best, the whole time I was gone, to make sure the second kind of news, the uneasy nights, the too close calls, never traveled any further than it strictly had to. Not out of secrecy for its own sake, out of care. I didn't want anyone in this room lying awake picturing worse than what was actually happening, and there's always a temptation, once you know a little, to imagine the rest far darker than the truth. That's rather what we did anyway, I said, not knowing anything at all. Corwin looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face softened further, if that was still possible after the whole of that long night. I know, he said, and that's the one part of this I got wrong, if I got anything wrong at all. I judged that not knowing would be easier for you than knowing a hard, worrying truth. I'm not certain now that it was. I think, looking at you tonight, that you might have carried the truth better than I gave you credit for. And I promise you, the next time duty asks something like this of me, I will think harder about how much you can bear, rather than simply protecting you from all of it by instinct. My father, listening to this exchange with the particular stillness he kept for moments he judged important, spoke then, and I have carried his words with me since nearly as closely as I have carried Corwin's. That is the hardest part of ruling a household or a kingdom or even simply raising a child, he said. Deciding, again and again, how much truth a person is ready for and getting it wrong sometimes in both directions. Too much, too soon, or too little, too late. I do not think either Corwin or I judged this perfectly, Torin. I think we judged it as carefully as we knew how, with the information we had, and that is very often the most any of us can honestly claim. I did not have an answer for that either, not that night, but I understood, hearing it, that the adults around me were not claiming to have handled the whole affair flawlessly, only carefully, and with real love behind every choice, even the choices I had spent 3 weeks resenting. That understanding settled into me more thoroughly than any single explanation had managed on its own, and I think it is, in the end, the truest thing I took away from the whole ordeal. That last thread, it turned out, closed almost gently for all the worry it had caused. The leak was traced, through Duke Edmund's careful cross-referencing of the night logs and duty rosters against who could possibly have known certain details on certain days, to a household undersecretary named Pell, a quiet, unremarkable man who had worked in the palace's administrative offices for a dozen years, and had fallen, over a long stretch of bad decisions with money he did not have, into a debt that made him vulnerable to the kind of people who pay well for small, apparently harmless pieces of information. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, known or cared what his information was ultimately used for. He had simply needed the money and told himself, the way people often do when they are choosing badly, that it could not really matter very much. He was relieved of his position and handed over to the proper magistrates the same week Corwin's work at Ashcombe reached its end. His case handled quietly and lawfully, with no drama and no violence, and as far as I ever heard, no great cruelty either. A sad, small betrayal born of debt and poor judgment rather than any deep wickedness, resolved the way such things are meant to be resolved, through evidence and procedure rather than anger. The man watching Ashcombe, never, my father was careful to tell me, someone who had gotten near enough to Adela to frighten her, since she had been kept, without her full knowledge, under a discreet extra watch the entire time, was identified through the proof Corwin had quietly gathered over those 3 weeks, and was taken into custody by the local constables in the town nearest the estate, acting on information passed to them through entirely proper channels. The old papers Adela had kept without understanding their weight were recovered, unharmed, and handed over to the same officials who had handled the original matter years before. No one had been hurt. No one, in the end, had even been especially frightened, except for the boy standing in his nightclothes at 1 in the morning, finally hearing the whole shape of what 3 weeks of silence had been built to protect. "Does Aunt Adela know how close it came?" I asked. "She knows now, and she is, characteristically, more concerned about the state of my nerves than her own," my father said, with the first real smile I had seen on him in weeks. She sends her love, and I believe she intends to thank Guard Hale herself, at length, in a manner he will find considerably more uncomfortable than anything he faced at Ashcombe. Corwin, to his credit, looked genuinely alarmed at that prospect, which was the first thing all night to make me laugh. We stayed up far too late that night, all of us, in a way that would ordinarily have earned Bram and me a stern word from our nurses the next morning, except that the next morning, when word had traveled through the household the way word always does, no one seemed inclined to scold anyone for anything. I remember Malin, hearing the news second-hand at breakfast, bursting into tears of relief in a manner that embarrassed her enormously, and that no one teased her for, not even Bram, who had the good sense, for once, to simply pat her hand and go back to his porridge. Before I finally let myself be sent to bed that first night, Corwin walked me back up the stairs himself, past the alcove with the hunting tapestry, and stopped there with me a moment, the way we used to stop most mornings before the day pulled us in different directions. "I need you to understand something," he said, "and I need you to really hear it, not just nod at it the way children sometimes nod at things they've decided are over. I did not leave because I didn't trust you. I left, and I stayed silent because I trusted you with something even harder than a secret. I trusted you to be strong enough to bear not knowing, for a little while, so that the people I was trying to protect could stay safe. That is not a small thing I asked of you. It is, in its way, one of the hardest things duty ever asks of anyone, grown or not, and you carried it. I am prouder of that than I know how to say." I did not have a grown answer for that, not at 11, standing in my nightclothes at the top of the stairs. I only told him I was glad he was home, and that I never wanted him to disappear like that again without at least telling me he loved me first, which made him laugh, and then, unexpectedly, made his eyes go bright in a way I had never once seen from him in 2 years of careful, composed friendship. "That," he said, "I can promise you. Whatever else duty asks of me, it will never ask me to leave without telling you that." The next morning, my father did something I had never seen him do before, and have only seen him do a handful of times since. He called the household guard to formal assembly in the forecourt, not the whole regiment, but the detail attached most closely to our own family's daily life, perhaps 30 men standing in 3 exact ranks in the cool morning light, Captain Bresson at their head, Sergeant Doyle and Corporal Wren and young Fenwick among them, and Corwin himself brought forward to stand alone before the ranks, still visibly weary from his 3 weeks away, but standing at a perfect, unbending attention that made him look, for a moment, like the very statue I had once been slightly afraid of at 9 years old. I watched from the top of the entrance steps, with Rowan's hand resting lightly on my shoulder, as my father addressed the assembled men. He did not tell them the details of where Corwin had been or what he had done. I understood even then that some of what had happened would remain sealed for good reason, known only to a small circle within the palace. But he told them plainly, in a voice that carried the whole length of the forecourt, that Guard Corwin Hale had served this family and this kingdom in the past weeks with a discipline and a quiet courage that few men were ever called upon to show, and that he had done it without complaint, without reward sought, and without a single word spoken out of turn about work that demanded absolute silence. He told them that the Crown recognized such service formally, and that a note of commendation would be entered into Corwin's record, the highest mark, I would learn later from Bresson, that the household guard's records were permitted to carry. "I ask you all," my father finished, "to remember, the next time this household closes ranks around a silence none of you can see the reason for, that the silence itself may be exactly this, a man doing his duty so well that the rest of us never even knew the danger had come near us at all. That is not concealment. That is protection, done properly, and I will not have it mistaken for anything less." The ranks of guards, to a man, stood a little straighter at that, and I saw Doyle's chin lift with something that looked very much like pride, and I understood, watching it, that my father had not called this assembly only for Corwin's sake, or even only for mine. He had called it for the whole household, servants and guards and family alike, so that the strange, frightening weeks we had all just lived through could be given a proper ending in the light of day, rather than left to dissolve quietly into rumor and half-answered questions, the way such things sometimes are. It was, I think, one of the wisest things I ever watched my father do, and I did not fully appreciate the wisdom of it until I was considerably older and understood how easily an unexplained silence, left unaddressed, can curdle into suspicion that lingers for years. Corwin, for his part, looked thoroughly uncomfortable through the whole of it, in the specific way disciplined men often look uncomfortable at being praised in public for doing precisely what they believe they were simply supposed to do. And when my father dismissed the assembly and the ranks broke into low, warm murmurs of congratulation around him, I saw him search the steps until he found me, and give me, across all that distance and all those other men, a small, private nod that belonged to no one else in the forecourt but the two of us. It took a little while, after that night, for the household to settle fully back into its old rhythm. A few days of Mistress Aldous pressing extra sweet buns on anyone who so much as glanced toward the kitchens. A formal, faintly comic visit from a grateful and slightly overwhelming Aunt Adela that left Corwin standing very stiffly at attention, while she thanked him at what I believe he privately considered excessive length. A quiet word passed down through Captain Bresson to the whole guard about the importance of controlling what gets said within earshot of a worried household. Delivered, Sergeant Doyle told me later with some satisfaction, in a tone that made certain that particular lesson would not need repeating. Master Pell's name was not spoken of much after that first week. My father had no interest in dwelling on the man's disgrace, and I came, over time, to understand that this too was a kind of mercy, extended even to someone who had done real harm through carelessness and need rather than cruelty. Aunt Adela's visit, when it came, a little over a week after Corwin's return, turned out to be one of the more memorable afternoons of that whole strange season, and I want to describe it properly rather than leave it as the passing mention it might otherwise seem. She arrived at Harrowgate in a carriage rather grander than her usual modest habits called for, which I later learned was entirely deliberate. She had told my father, apparently, that a man who had quietly protected her life and her family's dignity for 3 weeks, without once being thanked, properly deserved an entrance worth remembering, and she meant to give him one. She found Corwin at his post, of course, because that was where he could always be found. And rather than simply thank him and move on, as I think he had hoped and half expected, she planted herself directly in front of him in the alcove by the hunting tapestry, and proceeded to speak to him for the better part of 20 minutes, in the warm, unhurried, faintly theatrical manner I would come to learn was entirely characteristic of her, while a small, delighted audience of myself, Malin, and 2 off-duty guards who had found sudden urgent business in the corridor, gathered to watch. "I am told," she said, "that you spent 3 weeks of your life watching over an old woman who had absolutely no idea she needed watching over, sleeping badly in unfamiliar beds and eating, I imagine, considerably worse than you eat here. Also that I could go on arranging my roses and complaining about my knees in blissful ignorance of the fact that someone wished me harm. I want you to know that I find this both deeply alarming and deeply moving, and I have not yet decided which feeling is winning." Corwin, holding his position with admirable discipline despite the plain misery on his face at being addressed so directly and so publicly, managed only, "It was my duty, Your Highness, and no trouble at all," which made Adela laugh outright. "It was considerable trouble, and we both know it," she said, "and I will not have you pretend otherwise simply because it embarrasses you to be thanked properly. I intend to have you to Ashcombe for a proper dinner once matters have settled, where you will sit at my table as an honored guest rather than stand at my gate as a watchman, and you will not be permitted to refuse me, because I have already cleared it with your king, who assures me you have no legitimate grounds for objection." She turned to me before she left, taking both my hands in hers. She smelled, I remember, faintly of lavender and older paper, the particular smell of a woman who spent her days among books and gardens in equal measure, and told me, more quietly than she had spoken to Corwin, that she was sorry I had been made to suffer 3 weeks of worry on her account, though she added with a small, wry smile, rather touched to learn how deeply I cared for the man who had been protecting her. "I did not know, until your father told me the whole of it, how frightened you had been," she said. "I want you to know that if I had known what was being risked on my behalf while it was happening, I would have insisted on being told, and would very likely have made an enormous nuisance of myself about it, which is precisely why your father was wise not to tell me either. We were both kept in the dark for our own good, Torin, you and I both, and I find there is a strange comfort in that, in knowing I was not the only one this family judged too precious to be told the whole truth too soon." It had not occurred to me, until she said it, that Adela herself had spent those same 3 weeks unaware of the true danger circling her own quiet estate, trusting a household she could not see into that was working, without her knowledge, to keep her safe. It made the whole shape of the secrecy feel less like something done specifically to me, a boy judged too young to be trusted, and more like something the family did as a matter of principle, for anyone precious enough to be worth protecting that carefully. Which was, I think, exactly the understanding she had meant to give me. What I remember most clearly, though, from the weeks that followed, is not any of the drama of the ending, but the return of the ordinary, the small, daily thing I had not understood I was mourning until it came back to me. The first morning Corwin stood again at his post by the hunting tapestry, I came down before the household had properly stirred, the way I always used to, half expecting, even then, to find the alcove empty again, some last unkind trick of the weeks I had just lived through. He was there. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, in the exact stillness he always kept, and when he saw me come around the corner, his face did the thing it always used to do before any of this happened. The small, private easing at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and was not meant for anyone but me. "Morning, Your Highness," he said, as he always had. "Morning," I said back, and went and stood beside him the way I always had, and for a little while neither of us said anything else, because there was nothing that needed saying. The tapestry's huntsmen still chased their frozen quarry across the old, faded wool. The cold stone of the alcove was cold in exactly the way it had always been cold. And the man beside me, who I had spent 3 weeks fearing I had lost to disgrace or danger or something worse than either, was simply there again, solid and unremarkable and entirely present, the way the people we love most are present in the ordinary minutes we rarely think to notice until we have been given reason to notice them. I think, looking back on it now, that this is the part of the story I most want anyone hearing it to understand, not the danger, because in truth there was very little danger to me in any of it, and not even the mystery, though it kept me awake enough nights that I remember every turn of it clearly. It is this, that the silence which frightened me so badly was never, at any point, a wall built to shut me out because I did not matter enough to be told the truth. It was a wall built, carefully and at real cost to the people who built it, to keep something precious safe long enough for it to be protected properly. My great-aunt's safety, the integrity of an investigation that could have gone wrong in an instant if word of it had traveled the wrong way, and in its own smaller fashion, my own peace of mind, which the adults around me judged, rightly or not, would be better served by an ache of not knowing than by the weight of knowing everything too soon. I do not think I would have believed that, told to me plainly on the first morning Corwin's post stood empty. I do not think any 11-year-old could believe it, not really, not until it had been proven true by the return of the person the silence had been protecting. But I believe it now, all the way down, and I have carried it with me since, Through every later season of this family's life that has asked me to trust a silence I did not fully understand. And there have been a few, because Corwin Hale taught me, without ever meaning to make it a lesson, that the people who love you most are sometimes the ones who choose to let you hurt a little, quietly, rather than ask you to carry a danger you are not yet old enough to carry safely. He never did tell me every detail of those 3 weeks at Ashcombe, and I have never pressed him for the rest. Some of it, I understood even then, was not mine to know, and some of it, I suspect, is simply not the sort of thing a man carries easily into conversation, even with someone he trusts. What he gave me instead in the years since has been better than the full accounting I once thought I wanted. His word, kept without a single break, that he would never vanish from my life again without telling me first that I mattered to him. And the plain, daily proof of that promise, standing at his post each morning by the old hunting tapestry, exactly where he is meant to be. I am older now than I was that autumn, old enough to understand a great deal more about what the household guards of Eldermore are trained for, and what it costs some of them, quietly, to carry work that the rest of us are never meant to see. I understand, too, why my father chose the silence he chose, and why Duke Edmund held his own worry so carefully behind that flat, even voice in the corridor outside my door. They were not protecting a secret from me because I did not matter. They were protecting a family, Adela, and Corwin, and in the end even Master Pell, spared the added disgrace of a public scandal none of us needed, because that is what a household built on real duty and real honor does when it is tested. It does not perform its worry loudly. It closes ranks, quietly and completely, around the thing worth protecting, and it trusts that the people inside those ranks, even the youngest of them, will understand in time that the silence was never about doubt. It was about love, doing the only kind of work love sometimes has to do, the patient, unglamorous, entirely necessary work of waiting, and trusting, and holding on until the truth is finally safe enough to tell. That is what I hold on to now, whenever I think back to that empty stretch of corridor by the hunting tapestry, and the 3 longest weeks of my young life. Not the fear. The morning after, Corwin at his post again, the tapestry's huntsmen still chasing nothing at all across their faded old field, and the ordinary, precious, unremarkable fact of a good man standing exactly where he had promised, in the end, he always would.